everyone. I'm very glad to see so many of you to be here and listen to my story about, well, basically designing stories in free-to-play games. So first of all, how many of you have worked, are working, or maybe are dreaming to work on a mobile free-to-play game? Yeah, okay. Hopefully there will be some takeaways for you. So I'm Ieva Pikutytė. I'm a game designer at Nordcurrent in Vilnius. I currently oversee the design of several upcoming free-to-play projects. And just a bit about our studio. We have just celebrated our sweet 16th birthday in this industry, so we're quite a veteran, you could say. We have over 200 people working in Vilnius office, as well as in Warsaw and Odessa. And our focus is to develop and as well publish free-to-play games, mobile first. So naturally today I'm going to talk about free-to-play in mobile, and we'll look into some common pitfalls that we might encounter when designing mobile free-to-play games. And then we'll look into some examples from contemporary free-to-play games to see how we can come up with some solutions, and I will provide examples from basically successful games in the industry as well as some of our own, and we'll have a case study on dialogue and what not to do. So let's address the elephant in the room. Some of you may be thinking, like, why do I need narrative? Do I really need narrative to make it to the top? So let's look at some of the grossing games from App Annie, and just ask yourselves, how many do you think have any type of narrative? So while most of these games may not be story driven, they all have certain narrative techniques that help them enrich those games. So the thing is that even your players may not come to your game for the story, certain story elements might actually make them stay. Narrative design is still quite young in this mobile industry, so it's a bit of like a teenager, still confused with its identity, doesn't know where it's going, making a lot of mistakes on the way. And the roles of narrative designers themselves are often still downplayed to just dialogue writers, word people, someone who just puts finishing touches on a game that's basically already complete. Unfortunately, sometimes they even get to be the so-called narrative paramedics who have to swoop in at the very last minute and try to bring life to a kind of a stale game. So to really start designing effective narrative in mobile, we first have to conquer what I would like to call the 4 horsemen of the narrative apocalypse. So 4 misconceptions we may have when we are designing our strategies. This is very common. You might think that you can just do narrative in beta. So what happens, you draw all the art assets, you implement all the core features, and then you decide to cover it all up with dialogue and cutscenes. But the problem is your players are not actually engaged with your stories while they're playing the games, while they're engaging with the core loops. Then there's this dismissal that you just can't tell stories in free-to-play games. It's just useless, don't do it. So what really happens is we try to put in new content with updates, and players have already received their, motivation from the initial release, whatever story you had put there, so they don't have any more reasons to really come back to your game. Then there's a belief that unless players can read all the lore and all the backstories that you have written for months and months, they will not understand your worlds and they will not care about your characters. But what actually happens is we end up dumping a lot of exposition at the beginning of our games, and we lose players along the way. And finally, there's a dismissive belief that mobile players just don't care for story because they're busy, they're on a bus, they're just killing time in a queue, so we just go, screw narrative, and we just don't do it altogether. And it's very true that we do face quite specific challenges when we're designing stories for free-to-play mobile, because free-to-play has its specific things. New players are not very committed to our games. They just download it, they might try it out, they might drop out after 2 clicks. They are very easily distracted and very, very impatient. The play sessions are very short, so there's only so much you can actually do in that few minutes that the players are engaged with your game. Mobile screens obviously have very limited space, so you can't build all these amazing open worlds and just show them on this tiny iPhone. Then there's gates and paywalls that affect all the story pacing and that might take you out of the game. In-app purchases also usually exist outside of the game's world, outside of the world's logic. And story flow is often interrupted by video ads, right? So, no problem, right? So it does seem that there's a lot of working against stories and you could say even retention in general. But what narrative can actually do for you is it can make your players emotionally invested in your game. So you can help your players create a positive attachment to your game, which is not an unhealthy addiction, but instead it's a bond in a relationship that will keep them coming back for more. So all this is theory, right? So what can we actually do to basically just make our players care about the game? So, first of all, remember that the player is your most important character in their game, and it's all about their role in the game's world. So if you're thinking, where is my game going to be set in? What's the setting? You can start with a power fantasy. You can draw a lot from basic human desires. For example, as in these games, to have an aspirational, affluent lifestyle, to be respected, to be, to have street cred, to be desired and loved. So even if you think that your player character is going to be a robot or even an inanimate object like a box, their motivation should still be human. That is because it's something that we click with immediately on a very primal level. So whether you decide that the power fantasy you want to approach is something that your target audiences have, or you want to do something else entirely, it's very important to give your players agency to succeed. So design your game goals around the narrative goals. Make sure that the rewards and the obstacles all make sense with the narrative you're telling, and most importantly, that everything that the player does in the story is bringing them closer to the power fantasy, and the obstacles they have to overcome kind of provide obstacles from that power fantasy. So even if it's a linear game and there's really just an illusion of choice, players will be engaged as long as they feel like what they're doing inside the game's world actually matters. So for example, in our hidden object adventure, the power fantasy is to be the smartest one. So the player character is always ahead of the NPCs in connecting the dots, finding clues, calling out suspects, and just generally figuring things out first. So you design your dialogue, you design your puzzles to enforce this feeling for the player that only they and nobody else in this game's world can solve the crime. Now, when it comes to world building, you can often hear a phrase that you should show and not tell. Unfortunately, there is only so much you can really show on these tiny screens, and your players just really want to start playing, right? So what you can do is help your players experience your stories by letting them interact with it. So environmental storytelling is a very good way to do this, because you can set up a story using art, animation, and sound to bring these little scenes to life and let players explore them. It's very important to provide feedback for these scenes, because only then players will be encouraged to interact with the worlds and explore them. So at a glance, for example, here we get a sense of time, of a space, and we are curious to investigate this scene and see what's this all about. So by tapping on various things, players trigger animations, sound effects, comments from characters, and they also discover hidden collectibles, all of which tell you more about the game's world. So there's barely any text, but there's a story right there. It's very also important that you allow your players players experience the stories while they're engaging with the core loops. So, for example, instead of telling about the circumstances of this crime scene or doing this whole long bio on this character, you let your players explore these stories in interactive environments. So, because of the genre hidden object scene, your primary interaction is to inspect the scenes very closely and look for the objects. So, players inevitably immerse themselves in these interactive environments. Also, if you have screens that are visited quite often by your players, you can put some narrative there too. So, for example, this is a personal diary of our player character, and it's simple, it's non-intrusive, and you can still embed a lot of narrative just by using art. Now, every world, of course, needs engaging characters, right? The problem is that many free-to-play characters still exist as just tutorial guides or to-do list givers, but they don't actually do anything inside the game's world. So, because like I said, we relate to human emotions and qualities, when designing characters, we should focus on writing characters that players will relate to and will naturally care for more. So those characters should have both merits and flaws. They should be imperfect, just like we are, humans. They should have their own motivations in the world. They don't just wait there and wait for the player, to give him quests. They should have relationships with other characters, because it's a world. People build relationships. And most importantly, they should react to how players are impacting the world. Are they destroying it? Are they burning it to the core? Or are they making it a better place? It all has to have feedback. So, for example, these characters from Paradise Bay and Homescapes have their own traits, motivations, and voices. They lead their own lives. They have their own dreams. They don't just stand there waiting to serve the player. They also naturally react to current events, which corresponds to game updates, and more importantly, they react to what the player has done within their game worlds. Now, if you have a very fast-paced game and you just don't want to stop players and don't want to interrupt their flow, don't want to do dialogue, you can also exploit your social media for some narrative. So for Cooking Fever, for example, we use Facebook to post additional character stories like character bios or show dynamics between characters, like here, or National Beer Day. So what happens is our fans are engaged with this, and when they return to actually play the levels, they bring their own stories into the game, and it provides them context for why they're doing this. Now, if you're planning to do a dialogue and a lot of it, think about your goals and think about your scope. Because this is a very valuable lesson we learned from one of our games, The Order of Time Guardians, which is currently in soft launch. So when we first soft launched this game, we looked into our analytics tool to see, what the retention was, where players actually engaged with the game. So what we saw wasn't really satisfactory, and we noticed that we were losing a lot of players in the introductory chapter. So we inspected the dialogues inside that chapter. And because we had not set a clear scope for our dialogue, we were trying to do a lot. Giving character backstories, explaining how the time machine functioned, what the stakes were, and players were just like, well, no. The exposition was way too much, and they just wanted to actually play the game and experience all these things by themselves. So what we did, with a single iteration without changing any gameplay, we removed 20% of dialogue steps, completely scraped them. The remaining dialogue was rewritten to focus on only a single piece of the most important information, which actually reduced almost 40% of all symbols. Whenever possible, we try to turn some descriptions and exposition into interactions or environmental storytelling. And most importantly, we added a skip button to all dialogues and cutscenes. So what happened? After the dialogues were tweaked, much better results. players were more engaged, and the skip rate was actually relatively low and even decreased as they got more engaged with the game and they became more loyal to what was happening there. So takeaways from that, and in general, oh no, my slide has messed up. Okay. Choose one most important piece of information you want to tell. Then take as few steps as you need to actually tell it. Keep everything very simple and just short. Think Twitter, it's a good example of your symbol length. Whenever possible, if you wish, you can emphasize some keywords with font styles because it helps players read, it's very user-friendly, helps you skim information. If you want, you can also do interactive responses, which means instead of writing click to continue, you can have your player say, great, I'll do it, or even, okay then, because it gives your players a voice in your game's world. And most importantly, embrace the skip button. There will always be players who just don't care about story, and no matter what you do. So it's not worth losing them over writer's pride. Instead, you can enrich your games with flavor text. Flavor text can help you set the game's tone and also give short narrative bursts about the world and about its characters. So you can do this in item description, ability tooltips, achievement titles, or any other context you have designed in your game. So for example, this heavy mace from Dead Island is not just a placeholder, right? It has a name. It was fashioned lovingly by this character Sam B. So it's already personal. It already has a place in the game's world. Fallout Shelter has a very light-hearted tone for all its armor descriptions. So it sets the tone for the game that is casual, doesn't take itself too seriously. So yeah, think of what would work best for your game and exploit text in this way. Now, features specific to free-to-play can also benefit from a narrative dressing. So at its core, this is a simple free-to-play event, right? You play levels, you collect resources, you claim your rewards. But what makes it engaging is that its narrative context taps into our nurturing instincts. So instead of filling up a useless and meaningless progress bar, we're actually growing and taking care of our little pet Cropsy. So do you remember taking care of your Tamagotchis, for example? So, this might actually be similar to that, right? In-app purchases don't have to be lifeless transactions either. So here, a purchase for hard currency gems is also framed as an adoption for a cute kitty, and even the flavor text says that this is just a kitty you just can't help but love. Do you think that would push players over the edge? Would that make them care more and make this purchase? If you're designing for female audiences, it might just work. Just don't forget, don't exploit this too much. It has to be special. It has to be placed only once in a while. Now, let's face it, players really don't like gating mechanics. They don't like timers, energy systems, and the like. But what you can do, right? The problem is that most of these mechanics are not designed to make sense in the game's world. They just kind of take you out of the whole immersion experience. So think about what obstacles would be believable in your game's world. What would make sense? So in Happy Cafe, for example, players have to wait for crops to grow, meals to be cooked, seeds to be emptied. So the narrative fits with the timers. It's not so bothersome, it's not so intrusive, and players won't call this gating mechanic a cash grab, right? Social features, you don't have to hide them under settings screen, let's say. For example, here we have the Facebook Connect in Happy Cafe, framed as a subway system, which is also placed conveniently where the NPC customers also depart and arrive. So it's kind of this ecosystem of players visiting your cafe. And the following UI sort of lightly supports that theme as well. So, very important note, make sure that if you integrate these features in the game's world, that they're still accessible, they're easy to find, because otherwise it will just be very bad UX, and you don't want that. And finally, if you're doing video ads, you can give them a narrative dressing too. So most players will definitely just be motivated to collect their rewards, but it's the fiction that will keep them slightly immersed in the game's world still. So yeah, and let's face it, it's just way more fun to get a reward from a faraway realm, right? So to wrap up, there are many ways that narrative can help you, mostly to engage your players emotionally. So try to create meaningful goals for the player. Let them know not only what they have to do, but also why they're doing it. And if you make it so that that aligns with their core desires and their power fantasies, even better. Try to design interactive stories and give players high agency. So they should be empowered to interact with their worlds and see how their choices and how their actions are actually driving things forward. Focus on believable characters and immersive worlds. So always think about what's natural to human beings, what concepts, what experiences, what emotions. And if you can, try to put free-to-play features into a more natural context. It won't be so bothersome, players will be more forgiving, and we'll all have more fun in the end. So basically remember, we all return to things that we care about. Well, thank you very much for listening.